The morning of August 18th, 1944, near the French town of Lunéville, in the rolling farmland east of Nancy, Oberwachtmeister Franz Keller sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther OSFG, scanning the horizon through his scissors periscope. The late summer heat made the air shimmer above the engine deck behind him. He'd been a Panzer commander for 2 years, now survived the retreat from Kursk, the grinding battles across Ukraine, and now this desperate defense of France. His crew trusted him. His tank, number 431, had never been penetrated, not once. Through the haze, he spotted movement. American tank destroyers, their distinctive low profiles unmistakable even at this distance. M18 Hellcats, the crews called them. Fast, lightly armoured, mounting the same 76mm gun that was appearing on more and more American Shermans. Keller felt no particular alarm. He'd faced these guns before. Standard American armour-piercing rounds couldn't touch his frontal armour. The mathematics were simple, absolute, comforting. His Panther's glacis plate, 80mm of hardened steel set at 55 degrees, presented an effective thickness of 139mm to any shell striking it head-on. The American 76mm gun, firing its standard M62 ammunition, could penetrate only 109mm at 1,000 meters. The numbers didn't lie. Physics didn't negotiate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Keller gave the order to halt and prepare for engagement. His gunner, Schütze Hoffmann, had already identified the lead American vehicle. The range was perhaps 800 meters, well within killing distance for the Panther's long 75mm Quebel K-42 gun. They would destroy these Hellcats as they had destroyed so many Shermans before them. The loader slammed around into the breach. Hoffmann centered the reticle. The familiar routine of armored combat, executed with the confidence of veterans who knew their machine's superiority. The Hellcat fired first. What happened next would haunt Franz Keller for the rest of his life, though that life would last only 11 more days. The American round struck his Panther's upper glacis plate with a sound like a church bell being struck by a sledgehammer. But there was no deflection, no ricochet, no shower of sparks as the shell skittered away harmlessly. Instead, the projectile punched through 80mm of sloped armour as if it were tin sheeting. The tungsten penetrator continued through the interior, killing his radio operator instantly, severing hydraulic lines and igniting ammunition propellant bags stored beneath the turret basket. Within seconds, Keller's fortress, his mathematically proven sanctuary, was burning. He never had time to understand what had changed. Never learned that the Americans had deployed a new type of ammunition, a round with a tungsten carbide core travelling at velocities his training manuals had never mentioned. Never realized that the absolute faith he'd placed in his tank's invulnerability was based on calculations that no longer applied. 3 members of his crew died in that tank. Keller and his driver escaped with severe burns. The question that would torture him during his brief time in a field hospital, before sepsis claimed him, was brutally simple. How? This is the story of how German panzer crews discovered that their most formidable tanks, the machines they'd been taught were invincible from the front, could be defeated by a weapon they'd already learned to dismiss. It's the story of the 76mm high-velocity armour-piercing round, and the psychological collapse that occurred when mathematical certainty met tungsten core reality. But more than that, it's the story of how warfare's most dangerous illusion isn't propaganda or false intelligence. It's the comfort of assumptions that were true yesterday, but are lethally outdated today. To understand the magnitude of this psychological shock, we must first understand the world German panzer crews inhabited in the summer of 1944, a world built on layers of experience, doctrine, and engineering reality that had, until very recently, kept them alive. The Panther tank's development began as a direct response to a trauma. In the summer of 1941, German forces advancing into the Soviet Union encountered the T-34 medium tank and were stunned. Soviet tankers were employing a machine that combined thick, well-sloped armour with a powerful 76.2mm gun and excellent mobility. German tankers, equipped with Panzer IIs and early Panzer IVs, found themselves outmatched. The psychological impact rippled up through the command structure. Heinz Guderian himself ordered a full technical assessment. The conclusion was sobering. Germany needed a new medium tank immediately. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther, which entered production in January of 1943. The design borrowed the T-34's most significant innovation, heavily sloped armor. The Panther's frontal glacis plate was angled at 55 degrees from vertical. This wasn't merely an engineering preference, it was a mathematical force multiplier. When a projectile strikes sloped armor, it must penetrate a greater thickness of steel than the actual plate dimension. An 80mm plate at 55 degrees presents approximately 139 mm of effective armor against a shell fired horizontally at the tank's front. This was significantly more protection than the Tiger I's 100mm of vertical frontal armor. By the time Panthers reached the battlefield in significant numbers in 1944, German panzer crews had developed what can only be described as a fortress mentality. And this mentality wasn't based on propaganda or wishful thinking, it was built on repeated, verified battlefield experience. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, approximately 38% of the German tanks defending France were Panthers. American tank crews equipped with M4 Shermans mounting 75mm guns learned within days that frontal engagements with Panthers were suicidal. The standard American 75mm M3 gun, firing armor-piercing rounds, could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The tactical implications were immediate and brutal. American doctrine evolved out of necessity. A standard 5-tank Sherman platoon engaging German Panthers had to employ tactics that required extraordinary courage and accepted casualties as inevitable. One section would advance to draw the Panthers' fire, knowing they would likely be destroyed, while the second section attempted to maneuver around the German tank's flanks to strike its thinner side armor. This was not a theory. This was the practical reality of armored combat in France in the summer of 1944. Sherman crews weren't incompetent or poorly trained. They were simply outgunned in frontal engagements. For German Panther commanders, this tactical reality reinforced their sense of superiority daily. They could engage American medium tanks head-on with near impunity. Every frontal engagement that ended with a destroyed Sherman and an undamaged Panther validated the engineering choices that protected them. The psychological advantage was immense. In armored warfare, confidence in your vehicle's protection allows aggressive tactics. If you know the enemy can't hurt you from the front, you can advance, close range, deliver more accurate fire. The Panther crews weren't arrogant without cause. They were responding rationally to repeated evidence of their tank's superiority. But there was a problem developing in the American armored force, one that would ultimately shatter this German confidence. And it began with mounting casualties and an increasingly desperate search for a solution. In July of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy's hedgerow country, American tank losses became unsustainable. The U.S. Army had entered France expecting to face primarily Panzer IVs and a handful of heavy tanks. Instead, they encountered Panthers in numbers that intelligence had not predicted. Statistical analysis of captured German road wheels from just 2 Panther tanks allowed U.S. intelligence to estimate Panther production for February 1944 at 270 units. German records captured after the war showed actual production was 276 tanks that month. The Americans were facing far more advanced German armor than anticipated, and the standard Sherman's 75mm gun was inadequate. The U.S. Army had already developed a solution, or so they believed. Work on a more powerful gun for the Sherman had begun as early as July 1942. The result was the 76mm gun M1, which was essentially a lighter, more compact version of the 3-inch anti-tank gun already in service. The 76mm gun was mounted in a larger turret borrowed from the experimental T-23 medium tank. Production of these upgunned Shermans began in January 1944. By April, the first M4A1 tanks armed with 76mm guns arrived in Britain, ready for deployment to France. But higher-level commanders were hesitant. The 76mm gun had drawbacks. Its high-explosive shell contained only 0.8 to 6 pounds of explosive filler, compared to 1.4 to 7 pounds in the 75mm HE round. Since tanks spent far more time firing high-explosive rounds at infantry positions, bunkers, and au fait, field fortifications than engaging enemy armour. Many commanders viewed the 76mm as a downgrade for the Sherman's primary infantry support role. Additionally, the 76mm gun's muzzle blast kicked up enormous clouds of dust and debris, temporarily blinding the crew and revealing their position. Early production guns lacked muzzle brakes, compounding the problem. Tank commanders sometimes had to dismount and stand away from their vehicle, directing fire by radio through a long wire, just to see where their shots were landing. Most critically, initial testing suggested the 76mm gun still couldn't reliably defeat the Panthers' frontal armour. Using its standard M62 armour-piercing capped round, the 76mm could penetrate 109mm of armour at 1,000 metres. Against the Panthers' effective frontal protection of 139mm, this was insufficient. The gun could penetrate the Panthers' curved mantlet at very close range, perhaps 200 yards or less, but the mantlet's rounded shape meant shells often ricocheted upward or downward, rather than penetrating cleanly. General Eisenhower's frustration was palpable when he learned of this limitation. In July 1944, after reports of heavy American tank losses began flooding up the chain of command, he reportedly said, "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out? Why, I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war. Why is it that I'm the last to hear about this stuff? Ordnance told me this 76 would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." Despite these limitations, battlefield necessity overrode doctrinal hesitation. In late July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy 102 M4A1 Shermans armed with 76mm guns were rushed to France. They made their combat debut on July 25th, the operation's second day. The breakout succeeded, vindicating the decision to deploy the new gun. But the fundamental problem remained. American tank crews still couldn't reliably defeat Panthers in frontal engagements. What changed everything wasn't a new tank or a bigger gun. It was a projectile that weighed less than 9 kilograms. In the spring of 1944, American ordnance engineers had been working on an advanced ammunition type designated T4. The official nomenclature would later be changed to M93, but soldiers and tank crews simply called it HVAP high-velocity armour-piercing. The concept was revolutionary in its elegance. Instead of using a solid steel penetrator, the HVAP round employed a tungsten carbide core surrounded by an aluminum ballistic cap. Tungsten is extraordinarily dense, 19.2 to 5 grams per cubic centimetre, compared to steel's 7.8 to 5 grams per cubic centimetre. A smaller, denser penetrator travelling at higher velocity could defeat armour that larger steel projectiles could not. The physics were dramatic. The standard M62 round left the 76mm gun's barrel at 792 metres per second. The M93 HVAP round achieved a muzzle velocity of 1,036 metres per second, more than 240 metres per second faster. At 1,000 metres range, the HVAP round could penetrate 178 millimetres of armour. The Panthers' frontal glacis, with its effective thickness of 139 millimetres, was suddenly vulnerable. But there was a critical constraint. Tungsten carbide was a strategic material in desperately short supply. Before the war, the United States had imported most of its tungsten from China. With shipping routes contested and competing military demands for tungsten, in everything from machine tools to armour-piercing ammunition for multiple weapon systems, production of HVAP rounds was severely limited. Army in Europe received its first shipment, 2,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition, delivered by air freight. For context, the U. Army had thousands of tanks and tank destroyers in France by this point. 2,000 rounds was a fraction of what was needed. Distribution prioritized tank destroyer battalions, whose primary mission was defeating enemy armor. The average Sherman tank mounting a 76mm gun would receive perhaps 1 or 2 HVAP rounds per month if they received any at all. Some units never saw HVAP ammunition during the entire war. This scarcity would prove to be a factor in the ammunition's psychological impact. German panzer crews couldn't predict when they might face this new threat. Every 76mm gun became a potential source of lethal uncertainty. The first confirmed combat use of HVAP ammunition occurred on August 18, 1944, near Lunéville in northeastern France. M18. Hellcat tank destroyers from the 704th and 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalions engaged German armor during a counterattack. The results were devastating. The American tank destroyers destroyed 8 Panthers during the engagement without losing a single vehicle of their own. This was unprecedented. Previously, even tank destroyers with their dedicated anti-armor mission had struggled against Panthers in frontal engagements. Now, they were achieving kill ratios that reversed the tactical equation entirely. For the German panzer crews who survived these encounters, the experience was psychologically shattering. Understand what this meant from their perspective. These were experienced tankers. Many were Eastern Front veterans who'd been fighting in Panthers for 6 months or more. They'd developed elaborate mental models of combat based on repeated experience. They knew exactly which enemy weapons were dangerous and which were not. They knew their tank's protection enveloped the ranges and angles at which they were safe. Every decision they made, how to position their tank, when to advance, when to retreat, how aggressively to engage, was based on these calculations. And suddenly, without warning, the calculations were wrong. There was no gradual adjustment period, no tactical bulletin that reached the front lines warning them of the new threat. The first indication that something had changed was when supposedly safe frontal armor was penetrated. Some crews died instantly, never knowing what killed them. Others, like Franz Keller, survived long enough to experience the disorienting psychological aftermath of having their understanding of armored combat invalidated in an instant. The inability to predict when this new ammunition might appear amplified the psychological impact. If every American tank destroyer and every 76mm Sherman had been equipped with HVAP rounds, German crews could have adjusted their tactics accordingly. They would have known to avoid frontal engagements entirely, to rely exclusively on flanking attacks and ambush positions. But the ammunition's scarcity meant uncertainty. That M18 Hellcat 800 meters away, did it have HVAP rounds or standard ammunition? The Sherman advancing across the field, was it carrying one of those lethal tungsten core projectiles? There was no way to know until engagement, and by then it might be too late. This uncertainty eroded the confidence that had been the Panther crew's psychological armor. In armored warfare, hesitation kills. If you're uncertain whether you can survive a frontal engagement, you hesitate. You seek cover. You wait for better positioning. And in those extra seconds of caution, the enemy gains advantage. The fortress mentality that had sustained German panzer crews through the desperate fighting in France began to crack. September 1944 brought 2 major tank battles that demonstrated how thoroughly the tactical equation was changing. At Dompierre, France, between September 12th and 14th, the newly formed 112th Panzer Brigade, equipped primarily with Panthers, was decimated by the French 2nd Armoured Division. The Germans lost 34 Panthers in the engagement. French losses were minimal. Just weeks later, the Battle of Aracourt pitted Panther-equipped German forces against the U.S. 4th Armoured Division, part of Patton's Third Army. The American division was still primarily equipped with 75mm Shermans, yet the Germans again suffered catastrophic losses. Multiple factors contributed to these German defeats. The Panzer brigades were newly formed, with poorly trained crews and inadequate tactical coordination. They often stumbled into prepared American positions rather than executing coordinated attacks. German logistics were collapsing, leaving many tanks immobilized by fuel shortages or mechanical breakdowns. But among these factors was a new element. When American 76mm guns engaged Panthers, they were increasingly likely to achieve devastating penetrations. The HVAP ammunition, though still scarce, was beginning to appear in sufficient quantities to matter tactically. German tankers couldn't know the precise supply situation. They didn't know that by March 1945, approximately 18,000 HVAP rounds would reach Europe, with 42% allocated to the 76mm gun and the remainder to the 3-inch gun used in earlier tank destroyers. They experienced only the tactical reality. American guns that should have been harmless were punching through Panther armor with alarming frequency. Consider the psychological journey of a hypothetical German Panzer commander, let's call him Lieutenant Weber, stationed in France in the autumn of 1944. Weber had received his Panther in March and spent 4 months learning its capabilities. He'd knocked out 7 Allied tanks in combat, including 5 Shermans. He'd been hit 3 times, once by a 75mm Sherman, twice by anti-tank guns, and all 3 rounds had deflected harmlessly. His confidence in his tank's protection was absolute because it was based on empirical evidence. In September, Weber's company engaged American armor near Aracourt. The Americans were advancing across open farmland, poor terrain for defense, ideal for the Germans' superior optics and gun range. Weber's company commander ordered them forward to meet the attack. This was standard doctrine. Use the Panther's frontal immunity to close range and destroy the enemy with superior firepower. Weber had executed this maneuver successfully multiple times. At approximately 700 meters, an American tank destroyer fired. The round struck Weber's Panther's lower glacis plate, the slightly thinner armor below the main frontal plate, angled at 60 degrees. Weber felt the impact. He'd been hit before. He knew what a deflection felt like. But this time, there was no deflection. The projectile punched through the armor, travelled through the driver's compartment, and struck the transmission. The tank's engine died. Hydraulic fluid began spraying across hot metal. His driver was screaming over the intercom. Weber ordered immediate evacuation. His crew escaped seconds before the hydraulic fire reached ammunition storage. As they ran across the field toward German lines, Weber looked back at his burning tank and experienced something close to vertigo. Everything he understood about armoured combat had just been invalidated. If the lower glacis could be penetrated at 700 meters, then frontal attacks were suicidal. If American tank destroyers now carried ammunition capable of defeating Panther armour, then the tactical advantage Germany had enjoyed for months was gone. This wasn't an isolated psychological crisis. This was happening to Panther, crews across France. The fortress they'd trusted, the mathematical certainty that had allowed aggressive tactics, the confidence that came from technological superiority, all of it was eroding under the impact of tungsten core projectiles. And the worst was yet to come. In December 1944, Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler committed his last substantial armoured reserves to a desperate attempt to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive began on December 16th with complete tactical surprise. Panzer divisions smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. For the first few days, it appeared the German armour might achieve a breakthrough. But by this point in the war, the situation regarding American anti-tank capability had evolved significantly. By November 1944, approximately half of the 2nd Armoured Division's Shermans were armed with 76mm guns. More importantly, HVAP ammunition was becoming more widely available. Tank crews who had never seen these rounds before were now receiving small allocations, and they were learning how to use them. The tactical data was specific and brutal. With HVAP ammunition, an American 76mm gun could penetrate a Panther's lower front hull plate at 300 yards with near certainty. The glacis plate remained problematic. Even HVAP rounds had only approximately a 1 in 4 chance of clean penetration at 200 yards, largely because the extreme angle increased the likelihood of deflection. But the lower hull plate, the mantlet, and certainly the side armor, were all vulnerable at practical combat ranges. American tank crews had also learned sophisticated techniques for defeating Panthers. One particularly effective method involved aiming at the lower edge of the Panther's curved mantlet. A round striking this area at the correct angle would ricochet downward into the thin roof armor above the driver's compartment. This required skill and often multiple shots, but it worked. Tank crews practiced these techniques, shared knowledge across units, and developed an institutional understanding of Panther vulnerabilities. On December 19th, near the Belgian village of Vielsam, a Panther emerged from fog directly in front of retreating American forces. The German crew, overconfident in their tanks' capabilities and the chaos of the American retreat, was slow to react. A rearguard Sherman fired first. The American gunner placed his round exactly where he'd been trained to aim, the lower section of the curved mantlet. The shell ricocheted off the mantlet and struck downward onto the driver's hatch, one of the Panther's few truly weak points in the frontal aspect. The driver was killed instantly. The Panther stopped, immobilized but still dangerous. Under continued fire, the crew abandoned the vehicle. This engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it encapsulated everything that had changed since August. The American crew knew exactly where to aim. They fired with confidence rather than desperation. They had internalized the knowledge that Panthers were not invulnerable fortresses but machines with specific, exploitable weaknesses. And they had ammunition capable of penetrating Panther armor even when striking those weaknesses. For the German panzer forces committed to the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge became a grinding meat grinder that consumed men and machines with appalling efficiency. Fuel shortages, immobilized tanks, Allied air power, when weather cleared, destroyed vehicles by the dozen. American artillery concentrations shattered formations. But among all these factors was the simple tactical reality that American anti-tank capability had improved dramatically. The 76mm gun with HVAP ammunition had closed the firepower gap. Panthers were still formidable, but they were no longer invincible. The psychological impact on German crews was profound. Veterans who'd survived years of combat on the Eastern and Western fronts found themselves questioning judgments they'd made automatically for months. Should they advance to exploit an opening, or was that Sherman in the distance carrying HVAP rounds? Should they hold position and engage from distance, or would that give the enemy time to maneuver? The certainty that had allowed decisive action was replaced by hesitation and doubt. By January 1945, after the Bulge offensive had clearly failed, General Eisenhower sent explicit orders. No more 75mm Shermans were to be sent to Europe. Only tanks armed with 76mm guns would be accepted for deployment. This was a dramatic reversal from the previous summer, when many commanders had resisted the 76mm gun due to its inferior high-explosive performance. The necessity of defeating German armor had become paramount, and the 76mm gun with HVAP ammunition was now recognized as essential. Production of HVAP ammunition was increasing, though tungsten shortages meant it never became truly abundant. But the trend was clear. American anti-armor capability was improving, while German tank production was collapsing under Allied bombing and resource depletion. The tactical advantage was shifting irreversibly. What happened to men like Lieutenant Weber, the hypothetical Panther commander whose tank was destroyed near Aracourt? Some survived and were captured, some died in subsequent battles. Many simply disappeared into the chaos of Germany's final months, their fates unrecorded in the historical record, but all of them experienced a profound psychological reckoning. They had entered combat, believing in their tanks the way a medieval knight believed in his armor as an extension of their own survival, a tested and proven protection that had kept them alive through months of desperate fighting. And then, in moments measured in seconds, that belief was shattered by projectiles they couldn't see coming, fired from guns they'd learned to dismiss as harmless. The technical reality of what was happening to them was actually more limited than German crews could know. The HVAP round, for all its revolutionary penetrating power, had significant limitations that would have provided some comfort had they been aware of them. The tungsten core projectile lost velocity much faster than conventional armor-piercing rounds. while standard M62 ammunition maintained relatively consistent penetration capability out to 1,500 yards, the HVAP round's advantage decreased dramatically beyond 1,000 yards. At extended ranges, the lighter tungsten penetrator shed velocity so quickly that it actually performed worse than standard ammunition. Additionally, the HVAP round had a peculiar vulnerability against highly sloped armor. The original T4 version of the ammunition had a greater tendency to ricochet off steeply angled plates than most other projectiles. During autumn and winter of 1944, there were at least 2 production changes to improve the metallurgy of the round. The T4E17 version dominated autumn production, then was replaced by the T4E20 version around the end of the year. This final version was standardized as the M93 in February 1945. But even with these improvements, performance against the Panthers' glacis plate, that extremely steep 55-degree angle, remained problematic. A direct hit on the glacis had perhaps a 1 in 4 chance of clean penetration, with the remaining shots likely to deflect or shatter on impact. None of this information reached German tankers in actionable form. They experienced only the results, Panthers being destroyed in engagements that should have been survivable. Randomness was itself a weapon. If German crews had known precisely when HVAP rounds were being used and understood their specific limitations, they could have adapted tactically. They could have avoided close-range engagements, maintained distances beyond 1,000 yards where HVAP effectiveness dropped off, positioned their tanks to maximize the glacis plate's deflection angle. But they had no such knowledge. They faced only uncertainty, and uncertainty in combat is psychologically corrosive. Consider the information environment German panzer crews operated within during the autumn and winter of 1944. German military intelligence was aware that American tanks were receiving improved ammunition, but the specifics were murky. Captured American technical manuals took time to translate and disseminate. By the time accurate information about HVAP rounds reached unit level, the tactical situation had often already changed. Furthermore, German communication networks were degrading under constant Allied air attack. Radio messages were intercepted, couriers were killed or captured. The flow of reliable tactical intelligence that might have helped crews understand and respond to the new threat was disrupted. What did reach German tankers was anecdotal information from survivors, and survivor accounts are inherently biased toward the dramatic and the threatening. A Panther commander who escaped his burning tank after being hit by an HVAP round would report that American 76mm guns could now defeat Panther frontal armor. But he couldn't know whether he'd been struck by HVAP or whether his tank had been hit in one of its genuinely vulnerable spots by conventional ammunition. The lower hull plate, the mantlet edges, the driver's vision port, all of these were potentially vulnerable even to standard American rounds if struck precisely at close range. This meant the German tactical understanding of the threat was likely more pessimistic than reality warranted. If every penetration was attributed to some new wonder ammunition, the perceived threat expanded beyond the actual HVAP distribution. German crews began to assume that any 76mm gun might be carrying these deadly rounds, even though actual HVAP allocation remained limited throughout the war. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamental to how humans process threats under conditions of incomplete information. When facing an unpredictable danger, we tend to assume worst-case scenarios, because the cost of underestimating a threat can be fatal. A Panther commander who assumed every 76mm gun had HVAP ammunition would fight more cautiously, but he would survive longer than a commander who assumed HVAP was rare and could be ignored. Natural selection, operating at the level of combat tactics, favored pessimism. But tactical pessimism has costs. It means lost opportunities, defensive positioning when offensive action might succeed, retreat when advance was feasible. Across thousands of engagements, these small accumulated hesitations added up to strategic paralysis. German armor, which had previously operated with aggressive confidence, became cautious and reactive. When your doctrine depends on exploiting superior technology to achieve tactical victories against numerically superior enemies, losing confidence in that technology is catastrophic. By early 1945, the tactical situation had evolved beyond the question of HVAP ammunition. The United States was deploying the M26 Pershing heavy tank, armed with a 90mm gun that could defeat any German armour in service. The British were fielding more Firefly Shermans armed with the devastating 17-pounder gun. Even the Soviet forces in the east were deploying IS-2 heavy tanks, whose 122mm guns could penetrate Panther frontal armour at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. German armour was being outclassed on every front, simultaneously. But the psychological damage done by the HVAP round was disproportionate to its actual battlefield impact. It wasn't the most common round fired at Panthers. It wasn't even the most deadly threat German armour faced. That distinction belonged to Allied air power, which destroyed more German tanks than any ground-based weapon system. The HVAP round's significance was that it shattered the specific psychological confidence that had sustained Panther crews through months of combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. To understand why this mattered so much, we need to examine what modern military psychologists call unit cohesion under stress. Combat effectiveness doesn't depend solely on equipment or training. It depends critically on the mental state of the soldiers involved. A unit that believes it possesses superior equipment will accept casualties, take risks, and maintain aggressive posture because individual soldiers believe their actions contribute to eventual success. A unit that loses faith in its equipment becomes risk-averse, defensive, and prone to psychological collapse under pressure. German panzer forces in late 1944 were already under immense psychological strain from multiple sources. They were fighting a defensive war on German soil for the first time since Napoleon. Allied bombing was destroying their cities and killing their families. The Normandy invasion had demonstrated that Germany could no longer defend occupied Europe. The failed July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had revealed the regime's internal fractures. German soldiers knew, even if they couldn't admit it openly, that the war was lost. In this context, faith in their equipment, specifically in the Panther tank's superiority, was one of the few remaining sources of psychological strength. It was something concrete, verifiable, that could be trusted when everything else was collapsing. The Panther's armour had protected them. Its gun had killed enemy tanks. These were facts, proven repeatedly in combat. When American HVAP ammunition began defeating Panther frontal armour, it removed one of the last foundations of German tanker morale. The contrast with American tank crews is instructive. American tankers in France and Germany knew they were part of a vast industrial and military machine that would eventually grind Germany into submission. They knew that even if their individual tank was destroyed, it would be replaced. If they were killed, their position would be filled by another trained crew. They were part of a system with effectively unlimited resources. This knowledge provided psychological resilience even when facing superior German tanks. Yes, a frontal engagement with a Panther was dangerous. But if you could call in artillery or air support, or simply wait for reinforcements, you would eventually win. The long-term trajectory was clear. German tankers had no such confidence. Every tank lost was effectively irreplaceable. German industrial production was collapsing under Allied bombing. By late 1944, German tank factories were producing perhaps 300 Panthers per month, a respectable figure in isolation, but completely inadequate when facing Allied production of thousands of tanks monthly. Every crew killed represented an experience that couldn't be replaced. Training programs were shortened as manpower shortages intensified. New crews arrived at the front with minimal instruction, sometimes having never fired their main gun before entering combat. In this environment, the appearance of HVAP ammunition wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was confirmation of the inevitable. It was evidence that even the few technological advantages Germany retained were being systematically erased. It was one more indicator that no amount of skill or courage or superior engineering could overcome the material disparity between Germany and its enemies. The testimony of German prisoners captured during and after the Battle of the Bulge reveals this psychological state clearly. When interrogated about their morale and combat effectiveness, many Panzer crewmen expressed a kind of numb resignation. They would fight because they were soldiers, and that was their duty. But they no longer believed in victory. They no longer trusted that their equipment advantages would save them. They were going through the motions of combat while waiting for the inevitable end. Some historians have argued that the German army's combat effectiveness actually increased during its final defensive battles in 1945. German units inflicted higher casualties on advancing Allied forces per German soldier killed than at any previous point in the war. But this wasn't because German morale was high. It was because defensive combat in prepared positions requires less initiative and risk-taking than offensive operations. Demoralized troops can still fight effectively from fixed defenses. They simply cannot conduct the kind of aggressive, opportunistic armored warfare that had been Germany's specialty. The Panther tank remained a formidable weapon system until the end of the war. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun could defeat any Allied tank in service at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor, even accounting for HVAP ammunition, was still difficult to penetrate reliably. A well-positioned Panther in a defensive position, with good fields of fire and supporting infantry, was an extremely dangerous opponent. But German armor was increasingly unable to exploit these capabilities because the psychological foundation of confident, aggressive tactics had been eroded. There's a particular irony in how the war ended for German panzer forces. In the final weeks of April and early May 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin and Soviet armies surrounded the capital, hundreds of German tanks were destroyed or abandoned, not because they were defeated in combat, but because they ran out of fuel. Germany's oil supplies had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The elaborate synthetic fuel plants that had kept the Wehrmacht mobile were burning ruins. Panzer divisions that had fought across half of Europe came to a halt simply because their tanks couldn't move. Imagine being a Panther commander in those final days. Your tank is mechanically sound. Your ammunition is adequate. Your crew is trained. But you're sitting immobile beside a road because there's no diesel fuel. And, as you wait helplessly, Allied fighter bombers circle overhead or enemy tanks advance across fields you can see but cannot reach. The fortress you trusted has become a stationary pillbox, and then, as orders come to abandon equipment rather than let it be captured, it becomes an empty shell to be destroyed by your own demolition charges. This is how the Panthers' story ended. Not in dramatic tank battles where HVAP ammunition decided the outcome, but in pathetic abandonment as the infrastructure that sustained armored warfare simply ceased to exist. The psychological journey from confidence to doubt to resignation was mirrored by the material journey from technological advantage to parity to utter collapse. But our focus remains on that specific moment of psychological shock, that instant, when Franz Keller watched his supposedly invulnerable Panther penetrated by a weapon that shouldn't have been capable of threatening it. Because that moment, replicated across hundreds of engagements throughout late 1944 and early 1945, represented something profound about the nature of modern warfare. In previous eras, military technology changed slowly enough that a soldier could learn his equipment's capabilities and limitations early in his career and have that knowledge remain valid for years. A medieval archer knew what his bow could and couldn't do, and that didn't change throughout his life. A Napoleonic infantryman learned his musket's range and accuracy, and those parameters remained constant. Even in the First World War, while technology advanced rapidly, individual weapon systems remained relatively stable within the war's 4-year span. The Second World War broke this pattern. Technology advanced so rapidly that knowledge became obsolete within months. A German tanker who learned in early 1944 that his Panther's frontal armor was immune to American 76mm guns discovered by late 1944 that this was no longer true. And he had no reliable way to know when the change occurred or how widespread the new threat was. He was operating in an environment of constant tactical uncertainty, where yesterday's proven knowledge could become today's fatal assumption. This is the deeper significance of the HVAP ammunition story. It's not really about a specific projectile type or its technical specifications. It's about the psychological experience of fighting in a war where technological change happens faster than human adaptation can keep pace. It's about the dissolution of certainty in combat and what that does to soldiers' ability to function effectively under stress. Modern military forces have developed elaborate systems to manage this problem: real-time intelligence sharing, constant tactical updates, after-action reports that disseminate lessons learned within days rather than months. All of these are attempts to keep soldiers' understanding of the battlefield synchronized with rapidly changing reality. But these systems are themselves dependent on infrastructure that can be disrupted or destroyed. And even with perfect information flow, there remains an irreducible human lag between knowing intellectually that a threat exists and internalizing that knowledge at the instinctive level where combat decisions are made. Franz Keller didn't have any of these systems. He had his training from months earlier, his personal combat experience, and whatever fragmentary information filtered down from higher command. When the nature of the threat changed, he had no way to know until the moment that threat killed his crew. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or training. It was an inherent limitation of fighting in an era where technology advanced faster than information could propagate. The post-war fate of the Panther tank is itself revealing. After Germany's surrender, Allied forces captured hundreds of Panthers in various states of repair. The United States evaluated captured Panthers extensively, testing them against American weapons and analyzing their design. The conclusion was that the Panther was indeed an excellent tank, well-armored, powerfully armed, with good mobility when mechanically sound. But it was also over-engineered, difficult to maintain, and dependent on high-quality manufacturing that was impossible to sustain under wartime conditions. France operated captured Panthers for several years after the war, mainly because France's own tank industry needed time to recover. These French Panthers served without distinction and were quietly retired in the early 1950s. The Soviet Union captured hundreds of Panthers on the Eastern Front, but made no attempt to operate them long-term, instead using them for target practice to validate new anti-tank weapons. Britain evaluated Panthers, but never seriously considered adopting them. The tank that had dominated German panzer doctrine and shaped Allied tactical development simply disappeared from service within a few years of the war's end. Not because it was a bad design, but because the specific circumstances that made it effective, Germany's mid-war industrial capacity, skilled crews, and tactical doctrine emphasizing armored warfare, no longer existed. The Panther was optimized for a style of warfare that ended in May 1945. And what of the HVAP ammunition that so psychologically affected German panzer crews? The concept of a sub-caliber tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight sabot or ballistic cap proved sound. Post-war ammunition development refined this approach into armor-piercing fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds APFSDS in modern terminology, which remain the standard anti-tank ammunition for tank guns today. The tungsten core concept that first appeared in the M93 HVAP round evolved into the penetrators that armed American tanks throughout the Cold War and into the present era. The 76mm gun itself had a longer combat life than might be expected. When the Korean War began in June 1950, the United States rushed M4 Shermans, armed with 76mm guns, to the peninsula. These tanks faced Soviet-made T-34, 85 seconds operated by North Korean forces. The Americans had learned their lessons from the European theatre. This time, HVAP ammunition was plentiful, tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands. American tank crews had excellent training and superior optics. The result was that 76mm Shermans performed very well against T-34, 85 seconds, often achieving first-hit kills at ranges where the Soviet-designed tanks struggled to return effective fire. This reveals another layer of irony. The ammunition type that German crews experienced as a devastating surprise in 1944 became standard issue by 1950. What had been a scarce and unpredictable threat became routine. The technological advancement that seemed so revolutionary in the context of the Second World War was simply absorbed into normal military practice within a few years. For the men who experienced that technological transition as a combat shock, however, there was no comfort in this long-term perspective. Franz Keller died of infected burns in a German field hospital in late August 1944, never knowing that the weapon that destroyed his tank would become commonplace. Lieutenant Weber, our hypothetical Panther commander, might have survived the war, might have spent years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp before repatriation to West Germany in the 1950s, might have lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a peaceful, prosperous Europe. But he would always remember that moment when his tank was penetrated by a weapon he'd been taught couldn't hurt him. The human cost of these technological transitions is impossible to calculate precisely. How many German tankers died because they advanced with confidence that proved unjustified? How many survived with psychological trauma from having their understanding of combat suddenly invalidated? How many American tankers died in the months before HVAP ammunition became available, killed in desperate flanking attacks against Panthers they couldn't defeat frontally? These questions have no statistical answers because the counterfactuals are unknowable. What we can document is the aggregate result. By the spring of 1945, German armoured forces had been reduced to ineffectiveness, not primarily through combat losses, though those were severe, but through the accumulation of material shortages, fuel starvation, crew quality degradation, and, most importantly, the collapse of the psychological confidence that sustains aggressive armoured operations. The Panther crews who had felt invincible in early 1944 were dead, captured, or so psychologically battered by repeated shocks that they could no longer fight with the initiative and aggressiveness that armoured warfare demands. The final surrender in May 1945 came almost as a relief to many German soldiers. The alternative, continuing a hopeless fight, had become psychologically unsustainable. When you know the war is lost, when your equipment advantages have been negated, when every day brings only more death without purpose, surrender becomes not a failure of courage, but a rational choice. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many German Panzer veterans wrote memoirs or gave interviews that painted their combat experience in heroic terms. They emphasized their technical skill, their courage under fire, their adherence to military professionalism even in defeat. But careful reading of these accounts reveals the psychological scars beneath the martial rhetoric. They describe the constant fear, the mounting sense of futility, the moments when their training and equipment failed them without warning. They were trying to find meaning in experiences that had been, at their core, profoundly meaningless young men killing each other over territory that would change hands regardless, fighting for a regime that was already doomed, dying in service of strategic objectives that could never be achieved. The story of HVAP ammunition and the Panther tank is, in this sense, a microcosm of the entire late-war German experience. Germany began the war with technological and tactical advantages that generated early victories. The Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine, its well-trained troops, and its modern equipment allowed it to defeat larger forces through superior execution. But modern industrial warfare is fundamentally a contest of resources and production capacity. Germany's advantages were temporary. They could be matched and exceeded by opponents with greater industrial depth. Once the Allies closed the technological gap and brought their overwhelming material superiority to bear, Germany's defeat became inevitable. The Panther tank represented Germany's attempt to maintain technological edge, even as its strategic position collapsed. It was an excellent machine, well designed for its intended role. But excellence in tank design couldn't overcome fuel shortages, couldn't replace skilled crews faster than they were killed, couldn't win battles against opponents who could call in artillery strikes and air support whenever threatened. The psychological confidence that Panther crews derived from their tank's superiority was, in retrospect, a kind of denial, a refusal to acknowledge the larger strategic reality that Germany had already lost the war. And the HVAP round, that small tungsten core projectile, was simply the mechanism by which this denial was shattered. It wasn't the cause of German defeat. It was a symptom of the Allies' systematic technological progress and industrial mobilization. By the time HVAP ammunition appeared in combat, the war's outcome was already determined. But for individual German tankers experiencing that first penetration of supposedly impregnable armor, the HVAP round represented the moment when they could no longer sustain the illusion that superior equipment would save them. This is the fundamental tragedy embedded in this story. Not that Germany lost the Nazi regime's defeat was both inevitable and morally necessary. But so many young men on both sides died in the time between when defeat became inevitable and when surrender finally occurred. Franz Keller and the millions like him were fighting and dying for months or years after the war's outcome had been decided, by factors industrial production, resource availability, population demographics that individual combat effectiveness could not change. In late 1944, when HVAP ammunition first appeared in combat, Germany had already lost the war. The Normandy invasion was successful. Soviet forces were advancing across Poland toward Germany itself. German oil production was being systematically destroyed. The Atlantic Wall was breached. Italy had surrendered. Japan was being pushed back across the Pacific. No amount of tank armor could reverse these strategic realities. But wars don't end when their outcomes become inevitable. They end when the losing side acknowledges defeat, and that acknowledgement requires psychological acceptance that can take months or years to develop. The systematic erosion of German tanker confidence, through technological surprises like HVAP ammunition, was part of the process by which that psychological acceptance occurred. Each penetration of supposedly impregnable armor was another small proof that continuing the fight was futile. This might be the truest answer to the question of why the HVAP ammunition mattered psychologically far beyond its actual battlefield impact. It wasn't just that it could defeat Panther frontal armor that was significant tactically, but not strategically decisive. It was that it demonstrated, in immediate and visceral terms, that Germany could no longer maintain technological superiority. If American ordnance engineers could develop ammunition that negated the Panther's armor advantage, they could develop solutions to any German technological edge. The trajectory was clear. Germany's few remaining advantages would be systematically erased by opponents with superior resources and industrial capacity. For a German panzer commander in late 1944, understanding this trajectory required confronting the reality that his continued fighting was ultimately pointless, that he was risking his life and his crew's lives not to achieve victory that was already impossible, but simply to delay defeat by days or weeks. That kind of understanding is psychologically devastating. It drains combat effectiveness more surely than any ammunition shortage or mechanical breakdown. Some German soldiers managed to maintain fighting spirit through to the end by focusing narrowly on duty and comradeship. They fought to protect their fellow soldiers, to defend their homeland from invasion, to maintain professional military standards even in defeat. But this kind of motivation is fragile. It depends on not thinking too deeply about the larger strategic picture. The moment a soldier fully internalizes that his side has lost and continues fighting only produces pointless death, his will to continue dissolves. The HVAP round's psychological impact on German panzer crews was that it forced this realization. When your tank, your primary means of survival, your technological edge, your source of combat confidence, can be penetrated by weapons you thought were harmless, you have to confront the reality that your understanding of the war is wrong, and once that specific understanding is invalidated, other assumptions begin to crumble too. Maybe the intelligence briefings about American production capacity weren't exaggerated. Maybe the war really is lost. Maybe continuing to fight really is futile. This psychological cascade from confidence through doubt to resignation is what destroyed German armoured effectiveness in the war's final months, more completely than any amount of combat losses could have achieved. An army that has lost faith in its own effectiveness cannot fight effectively, no matter how good its equipment or training might be. The HVAP round was just one of many factors that produced this loss of faith, but its impact was disproportionate because it struck at one of the few remaining sources of German military confidence. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe. The morning air over Germany hung thick with contrails on January 27, 1943. Inside the cramped cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp squinted through his gun sight at the formation approaching from the west. He'd been flying combat missions since Spain in 1936. He'd faced RAF Hurricanes over Britain, Soviet Yaks over the Eastern Front, and American P-40 Warhawks over North Africa. He knew how bombers died a good burst from 400 yards, 20mm shells tearing through aluminum skin, engines catching fire, wings folding. This would be different. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 58 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses were making their way toward Wilhelmshaven in the first American daylight bombing raid against Germany proper. The Luftwaffe pilots had heard rumors about these aircraft flying fortresses. The Americans called them, but rumors were cheap. Philip had shot down 93 enemy aircraft. He knew his business. He pushed the throttle forward, angling for a tail attack. Standard procedure. The bomber formation grew larger in his windscreen. Then he saw them. Machine gun barrels. Dozens of them, protruding from every angle of every aircraft. The mid-morning sun glinted off polished metal and plexiglass turrets that swiveled to track his approach. Philip pressed his firing button. His cannons roared. Shell casings tumbled past his canopy. He watched his rounds strike home flashes of impact along the bomber's fuselage. The fortress shuddered. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away. But it kept flying. He fired again. More hits. The bomber's return fire intensified, tracers arcing toward him in streams of red and orange. He broke away hard, pulling 6 Gs, his vision tunneling. When he leveled out and looked back, the formation was unchanged, solid, unbroken. By the time German intelligence officers compiled their first comprehensive assessment of the B-17 in February 1943, the Luftwaffe had learned an uncomfortable truth. American heavy bombers absorbed punishment that would have obliterated any aircraft they'd previously encountered. A single raid might see dozens of German fighters empty their ammunition into the formations, scoring hundreds of hits, and still most of the fortresses made it home. The mathematics were brutal, and the answer kept pointing towards something the Germans hadn't fully appreciated, until they captured their first intact specimens and pried open the ammunition containers in the waist gun positions. Inside those metal cans lay rounds unlike anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The cartridge was massive, nearly 6 inches long, topped with a bullet half an inch in diameter. The brass casing gleamed dully in the winter light. German ordnance specialists measured it, weighed it, and subjected it to ballistic testing. What they discovered explained everything about why American gunners could reach out and touch German fighters at distances that seemed impossible, why tracer rounds from the bombers appeared to maintain their velocity for so long, why pilots reported that even glancing hits from these weapons could tear control surfaces apart or punch through armored windscreens. The Americans had brought the .50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge to the European theater, a round originally conceived during the First World War to defeat armored targets and aircraft, refined over 2 decades into something approaching perfection. The specifications told a story of industrial ambition: muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, muzzle energy exceeding 12,000 foot-pounds. For comparison, the standard German 7.92mm machine gun round backbone of Luftwaffe fighter armament generated roughly 2,800 foot-pounds of energy. The American defensive round hit 4 times harder, but raw power was only part of the equation. The Germans discovered that American ammunition came in carefully orchestrated combinations. Every 5th round was a tracer red-hot magnesium burning bright enough to track across miles of sky. Between the tracers came armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel cores, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that burst into flame on impact, and standard ball ammunition. The mixing ratio was deliberate, calculated to provide visual feedback for gunners while maximizing destructive effect. When a gunner squeezed his trigger, he was firing a stream of projectiles designed to punch through metal, ignite fuel, and demonstrate exactly where his bullets were going. The effective range was what truly disturbed German tactical planners. Luftwaffe doctrine had evolved around the assumption that bomber defensive armament was effective to perhaps 400 yards under ideal conditions. German fighter pilots trained to attack from 600 yards outside the danger zone, or so they believed. The 50 caliber Browning had an effective air-to-air range of approximately 700 yards. American gunners could begin engaging targets before German pilots expected to face return fire. That margin of 200 yards, roughly 6 football fields, represented the difference between attacking with impunity and flying into a wall of lead. German engineers examining captured B-17s in early 1943 found themselves confronting an aircraft that embodied a fundamentally different philosophy of aerial warfare. Where Luftwaffe bombers like the Heinkel He-111 or Junkers Ju-88 carried perhaps 3 to 5 machine guns for self-defense, the early B-17C model arrived in combat with 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 30 caliber gun in the nose. Inadequate, certainly, but the trajectory was clear. American doctrine called for layered, overlapping fields of defensive fire. By late 1942, field modifications were adding nose guns. By spring 1943, the B-17F model featured up to 11 50 caliber positions, and by summer, the B-17G bristled with 13 guns distributed across 9 positions. 13 guns per aircraft meant 13 streams of half-inch projectiles, each weapon capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. A single bomber at full defensive output could theoretically release over 9,000 rounds per minute into the surrounding airspace. But American bombers didn't fly alone. They flew in formations, combat boxes designed by Colonel Curtis LeMay and other tacticians to create overlapping fields of fire. A typical group formation might field 18 to 21 aircraft. That meant somewhere between 234 and 273 heavy machine guns pointing outward from a single bomber group. When multiple groups formed wing formations, the numbers climbed into the hundreds of guns. Luftwaffe pilots coined a term for these formations, fliegendes Stachelschwein, flying porcupine. It was an apt description. Approaching a combat box from any angle meant facing dozens of gun barrels tracking your movement, dozens of gunners calculating deflection, dozens of triggers waiting to be pulled. The psychological effect was profound. Many Luftwaffe veterans, men who'd faced Soviet anti-aircraft fire over Stalingrad or dodged RAF night fighters over the Channel, described attacking B-17 formations as the most nerve-wracking combat they'd experienced. Not because of accuracy. Bomber gunnery was notoriously difficult, hampered by cold altitude and the need to lead fast-moving targets, but because of volume, sheer, overwhelming volume. The ammunition expenditure figures told the story of American industrial capacity. A single 8th Air Force mission in 1943 might involve 300 bombers. If each bomber carried 7,500 rounds, a typical load for the B-17G, that single mission represented over 2 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in the sky simultaneously. The Street Louis ammunition plant alone produced 6.7 billion rounds of 30 caliber and 50 caliber ammunition during the war. In April 1945, shortly before Germany's surrender, the Army Air Forces in the European and Mediterranean theatres fired nearly 25 million rounds of machine gun and cannon ammunition in a single month, the vast majority 50 caliber. German quartermasters could calculate the implications. The Luftwaffe's entire fighter force in the West numbered roughly 800 aircraft by mid-1943. American bomber formations were bringing more machine guns to a single raid than the Luftwaffe had fighters to oppose them. And those machine guns were fed by supply chains that seemed limitless, ships crossing the Atlantic, trains rolling across England, trucks delivering to airfields, armourers loading fresh belts before every mission. The ammunition never stopped coming. But the story of the 50 caliber wasn't simply about overwhelming force. It was about the choices that overwhelming force imposed on German fighter tactics and the deadly calculus those choices created. In late 1942, when the first sustained American daylight bombing campaign began, Luftwaffe fighter pilots initially approached B-17 formations using tactics proven against RAF bombers. The standard attack profile called for positioning 600 yards behind and slightly above the target, diving to attack speed, opening fire with 20mm cannons and machine guns at 400 to 500 yards, then breaking away at 150 yards to avoid collision. Against Wellington or Sterling bombers flying at night, this worked. Against Halifax bombers with their modest defensive armament, this worked. Against B-17s in daylight, this got pilots killed. The mathematics of the engagement were unforgiving. A Focke-Wulf Fu-190 carried approximately 500 rounds for its cannons, enough for roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire at the cyclic rate. But nobody fired continuously. Effective gunnery required controlled bursts of 1 to 2 seconds. A skilled pilot might get 6 to 8 firing opportunities before his ammunition is exhausted. German after-action analysis indicated that approximately 20 hits from 20mm high-explosive rounds were needed to ensure destruction of a B-17 when attacking from the rear. The average Luftwaffe pilot achieved a hit rate of roughly 2%. That meant firing approximately 1,000 rounds to guarantee 20 hits. A single Fu-190 carried half that ammunition. The implications were stark. Unless a German pilot achieved exceptional accuracy 3 to 4% hit rates, twice the average, he would exhaust his ammunition before destroying a single bomber. And all of this assumed he survived the approach, the attack, and the escape. Every second spent within 700 yards of the formation meant exposure to defensive fire. Every second spent tracking a target meant flying predictably. Every second spent lining up a shot meant not evading. The 50 caliber rounds didn't need to hit pilots directly to be effective. They could shatter canopies, sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, damage engines, and destroy instruments. A single armor-piercing incendiary round, striking a wing root, could ignite fuel vapor and turn a fighter into a fireball. The armor-piercing rounds could penetrate the armored glass of a fighter's windscreen at ranges exceeding 400 yards. German pilots learned to fear not direct hits, but the accumulation of minor damage, a hydraulic line severed here, an aileron control, damage there that would leave them limping home or force landing in a field with a fighter too damaged to repair. By November 1942, Luftwaffe combat units were reporting that conventional stern attacks against B-17 formations produced unacceptable loss rates. For every bomber destroyed, the Germans were losing one or more fighters, and fighters were far harder to replace than bombers. Germany's industrial capacity was already strained. Pilot training took months. The Eastern Front consumed aircraft and pilots at a horrific rate. Every fighter lost over Germany was a fighter that couldn't be deployed against Soviet bombers or British night raiders. So German tacticians evolved. If attacking from behind meant flying through the heaviest defensive fire for the longest time, then attacking from ahead offered advantages. The nose of the early B-17F model was its weakest point, protected initially by just a single 30 caliber machine gun in the plexiglass nose compartment, later upgraded to twin 50 caliber guns in flexible mounts, but still offering less defensive firepower than the tail, waist, or turret positions. A head-on attack minimized exposure time. At a closing speed of 600 miles per hour, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, at full attack speed approaching a B-17, cruising at 200 miles per hour, the German pilot would be within firing range for only seconds. But those seconds offered a clear shot at the cockpit, the bombardier's position, the instrument panel, all vital areas where a few hits could mission kill an aircraft even if they didn't destroy it outright. The tactic was first systematically employed by Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II in late 1942. Meyer, a veteran pilot with over 60 victories, recognized that head-on attacks required different skills than traditional fighter combat. There was no time for sustained fire. No opportunity for correction. The pilot had to estimate range, lead the target, fire a concentrated burst, and break away all within 3 to 4 seconds. The closure rate was so high that depth perception became almost useless. Pilots had to rely on practiced judgment, firing from what felt like suicidal range, often 300 yards or less, trusting that their rounds would connect before the collision. It took exceptional courage. Lesser pilots would fire too early from too far away, wasting ammunition on empty sky, or they'd hesitate, breaking off before their rounds had time to strike home. The best pilots learned to hold steady until they could see the individual window panels on the bomber's nose, until they could distinguish the bombardier's face behind the plexiglass, until every instinct screamed at them to pull away. Only then would they fire a 3-second burst that emptied half their ammunition and then yank back on the stick, pulling up and over the bomber with perhaps 50 feet of clearance, wing-tip to wing-tip, close enough to see the American gunners tracking them with their weapons. When the technique worked, it was devastatingly effective. 20mm high-explosive shells entering through the nose would detonate inside the cockpit or forward compartment. The confined space amplified the blast effect. Pilots and bombardiers died instantly. Even near misses could be catastrophic. A shell striking the plexiglass would send fragments of glass and metal through the forward compartment like shrapnel. The sudden loss of cabin pressure at 25,000 feet would incapacitate anyone not properly protected. And critically, a B-17 with its pilot dead or wounded and its flight controls damaged would fall out of formation. Once a bomber left the protection of the group, it became vulnerable to follow-up attacks from any angle. By December 1942, head-on attacks had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against American day bombers. German fighter groups practiced the technique obsessively, running mock attacks against captured B-17s to calibrate the timing and develop the instinctive judgment needed for such split-second engagements. Training films showed the correct approach angles, the optimal firing points, the escape maneuvers that minimized exposure to defensive fire. The Luftwaffe was adapting, learning, evolving its tactics to counter the American strategic bombing offensive. But the Americans were evolving too. By January 1943, 8th Air Force bomber crews had identified the head-on attack as their most dangerous threat. Mission reports detailed fighters boring in from 12 o'clock high, cannons flashing, before screaming past with mere feet of separation. Loss rates among lead squadrons, which bore the brunt of frontal attacks, climbed steadily. Something had to change. The solution emerged from both official modification programs and unofficial field improvisation. Bomber groups began installing additional 50 caliber machine guns in the nose compartment, positioning them in flexible mounts that allowed the bombardier or navigator to engage targets ahead of the aircraft. The installations were crude, at first manually aimed weapons that required the operator to brace himself against the aircraft's structure and fight the slipstream. But they provided forward-firing capability that hadn't existed before. A fighter pilot approaching from ahead now faced not one 30 caliber pop gun but two 50 caliber heavy machine guns capable of reaching out 700 yards. The modifications spread through the 8th Air Force during early 1943, but the process was slow. Aircraft could only be modified when they weren't flying combat missions, and by spring 1943, the tempo of operations left little downtime. Groups improvised with whatever materials and expertise were available. Some installations were elegant, using standardized mounting hardware and ammunition feeds. Others were cobbled together from scrap metal and salvaged parts. But all of them shared a common purpose, filling the defensive gap that German pilots had learned to exploit. The official solution arrived in May 1943 when the first factory-equipped B-17F models with nose gun mountings reached England, followed soon after by the B-17G model, featuring the Bendix chin turret, a powered, remotely aimed turret mounting two 50 caliber guns beneath the nose. The chin turret was operated by the bombardier using a computing site that automatically calculated lead angles. It could traverse 160 degrees horizontally and 80 degrees vertically, covering virtually the entire forward hemisphere. More importantly, it allowed concentrated fire. Where flexible nose guns required the bombardier to manually track and lead a target while fighting wind blast and cold, the chin turret brought the same level of automation that dorsal and ball turrets had provided for other defensive positions. The impact on German tactics was immediate. Head-on attacks became vastly more dangerous. A fighter approaching from 12 o'clock now faced fire not just from nose guns, but from the top turret, which could depress slightly forward, and from any other gunner with a forward angle of fire. As the fighter closed to 300 yards, it was potentially facing 6 to 8 50 caliber machine guns, all aimed at a target moving directly toward them, with no deflection. At those ranges, Even relatively inexperienced gunners could achieve hits. The closure rate that had been the head-on attack's greatest advantage now became a liability. There was no time to evade. No opportunity to jink left or right. The fighter pilot was committed to a straight-line approach into concentrated fire. Luftwaffe loss rates in frontal attacks climbed through summer 1943. The tactic still worked. Skilled pilots still achieved kills, but the cost-exchange ratio shifted. For every bomber destroyed in a head-on pass, the Luftwaffe was losing fighters at unsustainable rates. And unlike the Americans, who could replace losses through massive industrial production and cross-Atlantic logistics, the Germans were already operating on the edge. Every pilot lost represented months of training that couldn't be recovered. Every aircraft destroyed represented production capacity diverted from other fronts. The tactical evolution continued on both sides, move and countermove, as the air war over Europe intensified through 1943. The Germans introduced new weapons, 30mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with 2 or 3 hits, 21cm rockets designed to break up formations from outside machine gun range, upward-firing cannon installations that allowed fighters to attack from directly below where defensive fire was weakest. The Americans responded with tighter formations, improved armor, better training, and always, more guns and more ammunition. But beneath the tactical back and forth lay a fundamental asymmetry that German intelligence officers understood, even if they couldn't overcome it. The Americans were fighting a war of industrial attrition that Germany couldn't win. Every .50 caliber round represented steel, brass, powder, and primers, produced by factories that bombed continuously, transported by ships that crossed the Atlantic in vast convoys, distributed by logistics networks that functioned with relentless efficiency. The ammunition was unlimited because the industrial base producing it was effectively unlimited. Germany, blockaded and bombed, fighting on multiple fronts, could not match that production. The Luftwaffe could innovate tactically. It could develop new weapons. It could train exceptional pilots. But it couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic of attrition. This reality would crystallize in the late summer and fall of 1943. When the Americans launched their most ambitious and costliest deep penetration raids into the heart of the Reich, the butcher's bill for these missions would demonstrate both the strengths and limitations of defensive armament in strategic bombing, and force both sides to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of air warfare. The date was August 17, 1943. The targets were Regensburg and Schweinfurt, 2 cities deep in southern Germany, well beyond the range of any fighter escort available to the Americans. Regensburg housed Messerschmitt production facilities. Schweinfurt contained nearly half of Germany's ball-bearing manufacturing capacity. Both were strategic targets, whose destruction could cripple German war production. Both were defended by concentrated flak batteries and positioned to allow Luftwaffe fighters maximum time to intercept before and after the bombing run. The plan called for a double strike. 146 B-17s would attack Regensburg, then continue south over the Alps to land at bases in North Africa, a shuttle bombing mission designed to complicate German defensive planning. 230 B-17s would strike Schweinfurt and return to England. The two forces would fly together for the initial penetration, splitting south of Frankfurt, presenting the Luftwaffe with multiple threats to defend simultaneously. At least, that was the plan. Dawn on August 17th found the airfields of eastern England covered with thick clouds. The weather forecast had predicted clearing, but the clearing didn't come. The Regensburg force managed to take off and form up, climbing through gaps in the clouds. The Schweinfurt force was delayed first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2 hours, as pilots waited for visibility that would allow safe formation assembly. The coordination that was supposed to split German defensive attention evaporated. The Luftwaffe would face 2 separate raids, one after the other, with hours to rearm and refuel between them. The Regensburg force crossed into Germany shortly after 9 in the morning, P-47. Thunderbolt escort fighters accompanied them to the German border, the absolute limit of the Thunderbolt's range, then turned back, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone. Jagdgeschwader 26 was waiting. The first attacks came as waves of Focke-Wulf 190s diving from high altitude, two plane elements executing head-on passes at 500 mph closing speeds. The lead squadron took the brunt. Within minutes, B-17s were falling, one with engines smoking, another trailing fuel, a third breaking apart as a direct hit from a rocket detonated in its bomb bay. The formations tightened, pilots flying closer together to maintain the overlapping defensive fields of fire that were their only protection. Gunners tracked targets, squeezed triggers, watched tracer rounds arc out toward attackers that appeared and vanished in seconds. The battle continued for over an hour as the bombers pushed deeper into Germany. Fighters attacked from every angle head-on, from the sides, from below using upward-firing cannons, from above in near-vertical dives. Some attacks were coordinated, multiple fighters converging on single bombers from different vectors. Others were solo pilots making repeated passes, exhausting their ammunition, landing at forward fields to rearm, then returning for another sortie. The ammunition expenditure on both sides was enormous. B-17 gunners burned through thousands of rounds, barrels overheating despite the frigid air at altitude. German pilots emptied their cannons, dove away, refueled and rearmed in as little as 10 minutes, then returned to the battle. By the time the Regensburg force reached its target and dropped its bombs, 24 B-17s had been shot down. Another dozen struggled with battle-damage wounded crew, failed engines, shredded control surfaces. The formation turned south, crossing the Alps, German fighters harassing them until they finally passed beyond reach. They landed in North Africa, counting losses, treating wounded, assessing damage. 3 more bombers were written off as too damaged to repair. The Schweinfurt force had it worse. Delayed for hours, they crossed into Germany in the early afternoon with no possibility of splitting Luftwaffe attention. Every fighter that had engaged the Regensburg mission had time to rearm and reposition. The Germans knew the target it had to be Schweinfurt or another industrial centre and concentrated their forces accordingly. 230 B-17s faced the full weight of the Western Luftwaffe's fighter force. The attacks were systematic and brutal. Fighter formations positioned themselves ahead of the bomber stream, allowing the fortresses to approach, then executed coordinated assault waves. Head-on attacks by Messerschmitt 109s created gaps in the formation. Follow-up attacks by heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190s exploited those gaps, concentrating fire on isolated bombers. Twin-engine Messerschmitt 1-10 Zerstörers bomber-destroyers equipped with heavy cannons made high-speed passes from the flanks. The defensive firepower of the B-17 formations took its toll. German fighters fell, some in flames, others trailing smoke, a few breaking apart under accumulated damage from dozens of hits. But the Luftwaffe had depth. Replacement fighters kept coming. 36 B-17s were shot down, dozens more limped home with severe damage. The combined loss for both missions, 60 B-17s destroyed, 12 more written off, hundreds of airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 38 fighters, a favourable kill ratio from the German perspective, though the loss of experienced pilots hurt more than the loss of aircraft. Both sides claimed victory. The Americans had struck deep into Germany and hit their targets. The Germans had inflicted unsustainable losses that would force a pause in deep penetration daylight raids. Both sides were right, and both faced uncomfortable questions about their strategies going forward. The autumn of 1943 brought what bomber crews began calling the Bloody Fall. The August raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt had demonstrated that unescorted heavy bombers, despite their formidable defensive armament, could not indefinitely sustain deep penetration missions against determined fighter opposition. The mathematics were inescapable. Even if every gunner performed perfectly, even if every 50 caliber round found its mark, the Luftwaffe could trade fighters for bombers at rates that ultimately favoured the defence. Germany was fighting on interior lines, able to concentrate forces at predicted targets. The bombers had to fly predictable routes dictated by fuel capacity, weather, and target selection. And, most critically, the bombers flew during daylight when Luftwaffe fighters could vector onto formations with visual precision. Yet, the strategic imperative demanded continuation of the bombing campaign. American doctrine held that precision daylight bombing could destroy Germany's industrial capacity and break its will to fight without requiring a costly ground invasion. The theory was elegant. The execution was proving extraordinarily expensive. September 6, 1943. Target: Stuttgart, at the extreme limit of B-17 range in mid-1943. 400 bombers launched. German fighters intercepted over France and maintained contact all the way to the target and back. The attacks were relentless, wave after wave, hour after hour. 45 bombers failed to return. The loss rate exceeded 10%. At that rate of attrition, a crew's statistical chance of surviving their required 25 mission tour approached zero. October 8. Target: Bremen, known to crews as Flak City for its concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. The combination of heavy flak over the target and sustained fighter attacks along the route cost 30 bombers. October 10th. Münster. The 100th Bomb Group, later known as the Bloody 100th, for its catastrophic loss rates, lost 12 of 13 aircraft on a single mission. Only one B-17 returned to base. The group effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit until replacements could be brought up. The tactical evolution continued. German fighter units had learned that the key to breaking bomber formations was concentration. Instead of attacking individually or in small groups, entire Jagdgeschwaders would mass their strength, sometimes 40 or 50 fighters, and execute coordinated assault waves against a single bomber group. The goal was not simply to destroy bombers, but to scatter the formation. Once a combat box broke apart, individual bombers became vulnerable to follow-up attacks from any angle. The overlapping fields of fire that provided mutual protection disappeared. What followed was a turkey shoot. The Luftwaffe also refined the bomber-destroyer concept. Specialized Fokker-Wulf 190 variants designated Sturmbock or Rambuck were armored to withstand defensive fire and armed with additional cannons. Some carried 4 30mm cannons, capable of destroying a bomber with a single burst. The Sturmbock pilots were volunteers, selected for aggressiveness and skill, organized into dedicated units, whose sole mission was to press attacks to point-blank range regardless of defensive fire. The tactic was effective but costly. Sturmbock pilots had life expectancies measured in single-digit missions. They accepted the risk because they understood what was at stake. Their country was being systematically destroyed from the air, and only their sacrifice could slow the onslaught. Against this evolved threat, the 13, 50 caliber guns on each B-17 represented formidable defensive capability, but not invincibility. The weapons themselves functioned superbly under conditions that would have disabled lesser designs. At 25,000 feet, where the bombers cruised, the temperature routinely dropped to 40 below zero Fahrenheit. The air was so thin that crews required supplemental oxygen continuously. Exposed metal froze on contact. Human skin could freeze in seconds. In this environment, the Browning M250 caliber kept firing. The weapon's reliability was legendary. Wartime studies found that stoppages averaged 1 per 4,000 rounds fired, and most malfunctions traced to faulty ammunition or improperly adjusted headspace, the critical gap between the bolt face and the barrel when locked. Armourers could adjust headspace in minutes, with the proper gauges. The ammunition feeding system, disintegrating metallic links that held individual rounds in belts, proved remarkably resistant to jamming even when frozen. Each gun had an electric heating element wrapped around the barrel jacket to prevent ice accumulation and maintain operating temperature. The heaters drew 24 volts from the aircraft's electrical system and could keep a barrel warm enough to function even during hour-long missions at extreme altitude. But reliability meant nothing if the gunners couldn't effectively engage targets. Gunnery from a bomber in formation presented challenges unlike any other form of aerial combat. Fighter pilots aimed their guns by aiming their entire aircraft, pointing the nose at the target, and firing forward-mounted weapons. Bomber gunners had to account for their own aircraft's speed, the target's speed, the convergence angle, wind drift, and the ballistic drop of their rounds. The computing gun sights, mounted in powered turrets, helped by automatically calculating deflection angles based on range and target motion. But the gunners in flexible positions guns. Nose guns relied on manual aiming using ring and post sights or simple reticles. Effective gunnery required instinct, developed through hundreds of hours of practice. The training never fully prepared crews for the reality. The first time a fighter came at you, boring in with guns flashing, the instinct was to flinch. The closing speed was so great that the fighter appeared as a dot one moment and filled your entire field of vision the next. The temptation was to open fire too early, wasting ammunition on a target still outside effective range, or to hold too long and miss the narrow window when rounds could connect. Combat veterans learned to control the fear response, to wait for the target to enter the kill zone 400 to 600 yards, then fire controlled bursts of 3 to 5 seconds, tracking the target's movement, watching for hits. The tracer rounds helped. Every fifth round burned bright red, creating visible streams that showed where your fire was going. Experienced gunners learned to walk their tracers onto target, making minute corrections until the streams of fire converged on the fighter. The expenditure of ammunition during sustained combat was staggering. A B-17G carried approximately 7,500 rounds distributed across its 13 gun positions. The waist guns received the largest allocation, 1,200 rounds each, because they covered the broadest arc and typically faced the heaviest combat. The tail guns had 565 rounds each. The chin turret carried 1,460 rounds. These numbers sounded substantial until you calculated firing time. At a cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute, a single gun could exhaust its ammunition in roughly 90 seconds of continuous fire. Nobody fired continuously. Barrel heating and accuracy concerns demanded burst fire. But during intense combat phases, when fighters pressed attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously, gunners could burn through their entire ammunition supply in 20 to 30 minutes. This created a cruel dilemma. Conservative fire discipline preserved ammunition but allowed more German fighters to press attacks unmolested, increasing damage to the formation. Aggressive fire discipline might drive off attackers but left guns empty when the next wave arrived. The solution was communication and fire coordination. The pilot or aircraft commander would announce threats over the intercom, fighters at 9 o'clock level, or bandits 12 o'clock high, allowing gunners to prioritize threats and avoid multiple gunners, firing at the same target while others went unengaged. The best crews developed an almost telepathic coordination, each gunner understanding his sector of responsibility, trusting his crewmates to cover their assigned zones. The physical demands on gunners were extraordinary. The waist gunners stood for hours at their positions, exposed to wind blast from the open gun windows, bracing against the aircraft's movements, absorbing the recoil of weapons firing inches from their bodies. They wore multiple layers of electrically heated clothing beneath leather flying suits, but the cold still penetrated. Frostbite was common. So was hypoxia, oxygen starvation caused by faulty equipment or damaged oxygen lines. A gunner suffering hypoxia might continue appearing to function while losing judgment and coordination, unable to recognize his own impairment until he collapsed. Crew discipline demanded that everyone continuously monitored everyone else for signs of hypoxia, slurred speech, erratic behavior, failure to respond to radio calls. The ball turret gunner had the most claustrophobic position. The Sperry ball turret was a sphere roughly 4 feet in diameter that hung beneath the bomber's fuselage, retracting partially into the aircraft during takeoff and landing. Inside this sphere, the gunner crouched in a fetal position with his knees drawn up, surrounded by machinery and ammunition. 250 caliber guns pointed downward and forward, controlled by a computing sight and hand controls that rotated the entire turret 360 degrees. The position offered unparalleled fields of fire below and to the sides of the aircraft, critical for defending against attacks from the lower hemisphere, but it was a coffin if the turret's electrical system failed, or if the aircraft had to make an emergency crash landing with insufficient time to retract the turret and extract the gunner. Ball turret gunners were typically the smallest members of the crew, selected for their ability to fit into the confined space. They trained extensively on emergency egress procedures, learning to disconnect their oxygen, electrical, and communication lines, rotate the turret to the access position, and squeeze through the access hatch into the aircraft interior in under 30 seconds. In combat, with battle damage disabling electrical systems, some ball turret gunners found themselves trapped in their spheres, unable to rotate to the egress position, forced to ride down in crash landings or bail out in their turrets. The survival rate for trapped ball turret gunners was effectively zero. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tail gunner occupied the loneliest position. Separated from the rest of the crew by the length of the fuselage, accessed through a narrow crawl space, barely large enough to squeeze through, the tail gunner sat backward in a cramped compartment, knees bent, operating twin 50 caliber guns that covered the rear approach. This was traditionally the most dangerous position because German fighters initially favored stern attacks. The tail gunner was the last line of defense, the man who had to remain calm and accurate while watching fighters grow larger in his sight, knowing that if he missed or malfunctioned, those fighters would hammer his aircraft with cannon fire. Some tail gunners recorded confirmed kills in double digits aerial victories that would have made them aces had they been flying fighters. Most never knew whether their fire destroyed, damaged, or simply scared off attackers. They kept firing, kept tracking, kept their sector clear. The top turret gunner, also the flight engineer, operated from a powered turret mounted above the fuselage behind the cockpit. His position offered excellent visibility and coverage of the upper hemisphere, making it critical for engaging fighters diving from high altitude. The top turret also served as a backup command position. If the pilot and co-pilot were incapacitated, the flight engineer had controls that allowed him to maintain level flight, not landing capability, but enough to keep the aircraft stable, while other crew members rendered first aid or prepared for bailout. Many aircraft returned home with dead or wounded pilots, kept aloft by flight engineers, who held formation for hours until reaching friendly territory. The radio operator manned a single, flexible 50 caliber gun that fired upward from a position behind the bomb bay. His primary duty was communication, monitoring frequencies, relaying commands, handling emergencies, but when fighters attacked, he became another gunner, adding to the defensive firepower. The same was true for the navigator and bombardier, who manned the nose guns when not engaged in their primary duties. Every man aboard was a soldier first and a specialist second. This cross-training was necessary because casualties were common and roles fluid. A waist gunner killed by fighter fire meant other crew members had to cover his position while managing their own responsibilities. An oxygen system failure in one compartment might force crew members to move to sections with functioning oxygen supplies. Battle damage could disable intercom systems, requiring hand signals or written notes to coordinate. The best crews trained together for months before combat, learning not just their own jobs but everyone else's, developing the versatility that meant the difference between mission completion and catastrophic failure. The missions to Schweinfurt in August had demonstrated the limits of defensive armament, but the raids didn't stop. Strategic bombing doctrine demanded continued pressure regardless of loss rates. 8th Air Force planners believed that if they could destroy enough ball-bearing production capacity, the entire German war machine would grind to a halt. Tanks, aircraft, vehicles, everything depended on precision bearings. Schweinfurt produced nearly half of Germany's supply. Destroy Schweinfurt, and you cripple German industry for months, perhaps permanently. So on October 14th, 1943, they went back. 291 B-17s launched that morning, bound for Schweinfurt. The weather over England was clear. The Germans would have hours of warning as the formations assembled and headed east. There would be no surprise, no tactical advantage. The bombers would fly into the teeth of concentrated defences in daylight, with every German fighter pilot in the west vectoring to intercept. The crews knew the odds. At the mission briefing, when the curtain pulled back to reveal Schweinfurt as the target, a nervous laugh rippled through the room. Someone muttered, "Goodbye," loud enough to be heard. The comment drew chuckles, dark humour that masked genuine dread. They'd all studied the loss figures from the August raid. They knew what Schweinfurt meant. Colonel Elliot van der Wanter, addressing the 385th Bomb Group at Great Ashfield, kept his briefing matter of fact. "This is a tough job, and I know you can do it. Good luck, good bombing, and good hunting." The men filed out to their aircraft, knowing that statistically, 1 in 5 would not return. The first fighters appeared shortly after. The bombers crossed the German frontier. The escort Thunderbolts, flying at the absolute limit of their range, turned back reluctantly, waggling their wings in farewell. The bombers continued alone. What followed was later described by official Air Force historians as unprecedented in magnitude, cleverness, and severity. The Luftwaffe had learned from August. This time they coordinated their attacks with precision. Fighter formations positioned ahead of the bomber stream, allowing the fortresses to come to them rather than exhausting fuel in pursuit. The first assault wave consisted primarily of Messerschmitt 109s fast, nimble fighters optimized for high-altitude combat. Their mission was to engage and disrupt, breaking up the tight formation geometry that provided mutual defensive coverage. They dove from high altitude, executed slashing attacks with cannon and machine gun fire, then climbed away before the massed defensive fire could find them. The second wave came minutes later, heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190s and twin-engine Messerschmitt 1-10 Zersterers bristling with cannons. These were the bomber killers, designed specifically to destroy heavy aircraft. Some carried multiple 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart with a single burst. Others were equipped with 21cm rockets, unguided missiles with 40-pound warheads, launched from tubes beneath the wings. The rockets were inaccurate but devastating. A direct hit would vaporize a bomber instantly. A near miss could inflict enough damage to force the aircraft out of formation, making it vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The defensive fire from the bomber formations was intense. Hundreds of 50-caliber guns tracked the incoming fighters, streams of tracers crisscrossing the sky in deadly patterns. German pilots described flying through the defensive fire as like flying through a thunderstorm made of steel. The air itself seemed solid with bullets. Some pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination, closing to point-blank range before firing, accepting hits to their aircraft in exchange for certain kills. Others made high-speed passes from outside optimal range, firing long bursts in hopes of lucky hits, breaking away as soon as the defensive fire grew too intense. The battle continued for hours as the formations pushed toward Schweinfurt. Bombers fell, some trailing fire, others breaking apart in mid-air, a few simply dropping out of formation with engines silent, gliding down toward German territory where survivors would become prisoners. Fighters fell too, spinning down in flames or tumbling end over end, wings torn off by exploding ammunition. The sky between the Dutch border and Schweinfurt became a vertical battlefield, littered with falling debris, burning aircraft, parachutes, spent shell casings glinting in the autumn sun. The bombers reached Schweinfurt shortly after 2 in the afternoon. Flak filled the sky-black clouds of exploding 88mm shells that left the air stinking of cordite. The bombardiers worked their sights, compensating for wind drift and altitude, releasing their loads over the target. Bombs tumbled down, spinning, accelerating, impacting the factories and rail yards in fountains of smoke and debris. Then the formations turned for home. The German fighters were waiting. They'd landed, refueled, rearmed, and positioned themselves along the withdrawal route. The exhausted bomber crews, low on ammunition, many aircraft already damaged, faced fresh attackers. The losses mounted. Radio discipline broke down as crews called out targets, warned of attacks, and screamed for help from fighters that weren't there. Some bomber formations fragmented entirely, individual aircraft attempting to make their own way home through hostile airspace. 60 B-17s were shot down over Germany. 5 more crashed or crash-landed in England, 2 damaged to save. 12 additional aircraft were damaged beyond economical repair and written off. 17 were permanently lost casualties inflicted on aircraft that flew subsequent missions before accumulating enough damage to be retired. The total losses exceeded 1/3 of the attacking force. 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters, a kill ratio of roughly 3 bombers for every 2 fighters. The mission achieved its objective. The Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants were heavily damaged, production disrupted for months, but the cost was prohibitive. At that loss rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within weeks. Strategic bombing doctrine had collided with tactical reality. The theory that massed heavy bombers could defend themselves sufficiently to operate without escort in daylight over heavily defended targets was disproven. The 50 caliber defensive armament, as powerful and reliable as it was, could not overcome numerical and tactical disadvantages. October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday. It marked the end of unescorted deep-penetration daylight bombing by the 8th Air Force. Strategic raids beyond fighter range were suspended indefinitely. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt until February 1944, and when they did, they would be escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, equipped with drop tanks that extended their combat radius to cover targets throughout Germany. The pause in operations allowed both sides to reassess. For the Luftwaffe, Black Thursday seemed to validate their defensive strategy. The combined losses inflicted during the October raids, 120 bombers destroyed in 3 missions, suggested that sustained attrition could halt the American offensive. German propaganda celebrated the victory, declaring that the daylight bombers had been defeated. Luftwaffe commanders pushed for more resources to be allocated to homeland defense, arguing that the Western Front deserved priority over the Eastern Front's insatiable demand for aircraft and pilots. But the celebration was premature. The Luftwaffe had won a tactical victory while losing the strategic war. Every German fighter defending the homeland was a fighter not available for ground support in Russia or the Mediterranean. Every pilot lost over Germany was an irreplaceable veteran whose experience couldn't be transmitted to undertrained replacements arriving from flight schools. And most critically, the production figures told a story that no amount of tactical success could overcome. In October 1943, American factories produced roughly 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s, and B-24s combined. German factories produced approximately 1,000 fighters of all types, including single-engine, twin-engine, night fighters, and ground attack aircraft. The Americans could replace their October losses in 3 weeks. The Germans needed a month to replace theirs, while simultaneously covering losses on other fronts. And the American production rate was increasing, while German production was constrained by raw material shortages, bombing damage, and labor shortages as millions of men were consumed by the Eastern Front. The ammunition production disparity was even more stark. American plants produced over 6 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the war, roughly 200,000 rounds per day, averaged across the entire conflict. German production of 20mm cannon ammunition totaled approximately 400 million rounds for all calibers of aircraft cannon combined. The Americans produced more defensive ammunition for their bombers than the Germans produced offensive ammunition for their fighters. The strategic implications were inescapable. Germany was fighting an attritional war it could not win. Every fighter lost, every pilot killed, every round of ammunition expended brought the Luftwaffe closer to collapse. The Americans could sustain losses that would have crippled any other air force because their industrial base was essentially unlimited and positioned beyond the reach of German retaliation. British factories were bombed but never shut down. American factories never faced enemy action at all. The production machines operated continuously, fed by resources from an entire continent, staffed by workers who never experienced shortages or bombardment. The B-17's 1350 caliber guns were a symbol of this industrial supremacy. Each gun represented dozens of precision components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Each round of ammunition required brass, steel, powder, and primers materials that Germany was increasingly unable to secure. The fact that American planners could contemplate arming a single bomber with 13 heavy machine guns and loading it with 7,500 rounds demonstrated a level of industrial excess that Germany simply could not match. German engineers examining captured American equipment during this period reported findings that were simultaneously impressive and demoralizing. The manufacturing quality was exceptional, precision machining, standardized parts that were genuinely interchangeable, assembly techniques that prioritized speed without sacrificing reliability. The Americans had clearly spent years developing production systems optimized for mass manufacture. Every component showed evidence of design for manufacturing principles: simplified geometries, reduced part counts, clever uses of stamping and casting to replace machined components. The 50 caliber guns were exemplary in this regard, relatively simple designs that could be produced rapidly while maintaining the tight tolerances necessary for reliability. But it was the logistics that truly impressed German analysts. Captured B-17s contained maintenance logs and inspection records that revealed American supply chains functioned with clockwork regularity. Spare parts arrived on schedule. Ammunition was never in short supply. Maintenance intervals were rigidly enforced. Aircraft that reached specified flight hours were pulled from service for depot-level overhaul regardless of their apparent condition. This was preventive maintenance elevated to doctrine, a luxury afforded only by abundant resources. German maintenance practices, by contrast, were increasingly dominated by crisis management. Aircraft flew well beyond their designed service lives because replacements weren't available. Maintenance was deferred until failure became imminent. Spare parts were cannibalized from damaged aircraft or improvised from whatever materials could be found. The Luftwaffe's technical capability hadn't diminished their engineers, and mechanics remained among the best in the world, but they were forced to work with ever-shrinking resources while facing ever-increasing demands. The ammunition situation illustrated the disparity perfectly. 50 caliber rounds were everywhere in American supply chains, stockpiled at bases, loaded aboard ships, warehoused in depots across England. If a bomber group exhausted its allocation during intense combat, replacement ammunition arrived within days. German fighter groups, by contrast, faced chronic ammunition shortages by late 1943. Cannon rounds were strictly rationed. Pilots were ordered to fire only when hits were certain, to break off attacks rather than waste ammunition on low-probability shots. This conservation mindset directly contradicted the aggressive tactics needed to defeat bomber formations. A pilot trying to conserve ammunition was a pilot who couldn't effectively engage. The fuel situation was equally constraining. Germany's synthetic fuel production, critical because Germany lacked natural petroleum reserves, was insufficient to meet military demands even before Allied bombing began targeting refineries. By 1943, fuel allocations for training were being cut to preserve supplies for combat operations. New pilots arrived at frontline units with perhaps 50 flight hours, a fraction of the training their opponents received. The Americans could afford to give their pilots hundreds of hours of flight time before combat deployment. German pilots learned on the job or died trying. The winter of 1943 passed with the 8th Air Force rebuilding strength and waiting for the arrival of long-range escort fighters. The bombers still flew attacking targets within fighter range, hitting coastal installations, maintaining pressure, but the deep penetration raids that had characterized the Bloody Fall were suspended. Crews trained replacement personnel, aircraft were repaired and upgraded, and planners studied the lessons of Schweinfurt. The Germans used the respite to strengthen their defences. More fighters were pulled back from other fronts. Anti-aircraft batteries proliferated around key industrial targets. Luftwaffe tactics became increasingly sophisticated, with ground controllers vectoring fighters to optimal intercept points using radar data and observer reports. The defence in depth was formidable early warning from occupied territories, fighter intercepts during approach, concentrated flak over targets, and renewed fighter attacks during withdrawal. Every element was designed to maximize bomber attrition while minimizing German losses, but the respite was temporary. In February 1944, the nature of the air war over Europe changed fundamentally with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in substantial numbers. The Mustang was revolutionary not because of superior performance, though it was fast and maneuverable, but because of range. Equipped with drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a combat radius that covered virtually every strategic target in the Reich. The era of unescorted daylight raids was over. The era of escorted raids was beginning, and with it came the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter force. The new tactics were straightforward. Escort fighters didn't simply protect bombers, they actively hunted German fighters, flying ahead of the bomber stream to clear the airspace, engaging intercept formations before they could reach the bombers, pursuing damaged German aircraft back to their airfields. The Mustang pilots had orders to be aggressive, to take the fight to the Luftwaffe, to destroy German fighters in the air or on the ground. The strategic goal had evolved from merely bombing targets to achieving air supremacy through attrition of the enemy fighter force. The B-17 formations still relied on their defensive armament. The 1350 caliber guns remained crucial for self-protection, but now they operated within an envelope of fighter cover that fundamentally altered the tactical equation. German fighters attempting to attack bombers had to first fight through American escort fighters, then face the massed defensive fire of the formations, then escape through the escorts again. The mathematics of attrition now heavily favored the attackers. The Luftwaffe loss rates climbed steeply through spring 1944. Experienced pilots, the veterans who'd survived years of combat, fell at an accelerating pace. Their replacements arrived with minimal training, inadequate flight hours, and virtually no gunnery practice. A German pilot in early 1944 might have 30 hours of flight time before his first combat mission. His American opponent likely had 300 hours or more. The skill disparity was crushing. German pilots who survived their first 10 missions had reasonable chances of continued survival, but most didn't survive their first 10 missions. The quality of German equipment also began to deteriorate. Shortages of critical materials forced substitutions, aluminum components replaced with steel, increasing weight and reducing performance. Manufacturing shortcuts became common as production quotas took priority over quality control. Aircraft that would have been rejected in 1942 now entered service with known defects that crews were expected to manage. The reliability that had characterized German engineering declined as the industrial base crumbled under sustained bombing and resource depletion. The .50 caliber ammunition continued flowing to American bomber units in quantities that seemed limitless. Mission planning assumed unlimited ammunition availability. If a group exhausted its stocks during intense combat, replacement supplies arrived before the next mission. The supply system was so robust that waste became acceptable. Partially expended ammunition belts were often discarded rather than reloaded to avoid the risk of feeding malfunctions. Fresh ammunition for every mission was standard practice. By spring 1944, the defensive armament of the B-17 had reached its final evolution. The B-17G model, with its 13 guns and refined ammunition distribution, represented the culmination of 3 years of combat experience and iterative improvement. The placement of weapons covered virtually every approach vector. The ammunition types were optimized for anti-fighter work, predominantly armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could penetrate fighter armor and ignite fuel with a single hit. The computing sights in powered turrets gave even average gunners accuracy that would have been impossible with manual aiming. And most importantly, the crews were veterans who understood their weapons and aircraft intimately. The typical B-17 gunner in mid-1944 had characteristics that would have seemed impossible in 1942. He'd flown 20 or more missions, survived dozens of fighter attacks, developed instincts that bordered on precognitive. He could identify German fighter types at maximum visual range. He knew which attacks were serious and which were feints. He understood ammunition conservation, when to fire and when to hold without being told. He maintained his weapon to standards that exceeded manual specifications because he understood that reliability meant survival. These weren't conscripts learning on the job. They were combat veterans with skills honed through repetition under mortal pressure. The German pilots faced increasingly impossible odds. Attacking a bomber formation now meant running a gauntlet of escort fighters, then facing the concentrated fire of hundreds of .50 caliber guns manned by experienced gunners, then escaping through the escorts again, all while flying aircraft that might be suffering mechanical problems, burning fuel that was adulterated with synthetic additives that reduced engine performance, armed with ammunition that had been stored improperly and might malfunction. The courage required was extraordinary. The survival rates were abysmal. Some German pilots accumulated staggering victory totals despite these conditions. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer destroyed 121 Allied aircraft, mostly heavy bombers, making him the highest-scoring night fighter ace in history. Major Wilhelm Moritz of Jagdgeschwader 3 destroyed 33 4-engine bombers in daylight combat. These were exceptional pilots flying with exceptional skill and determination, but they were exceptions. The average German fighter pilot in late 1944 survived perhaps a dozen missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. The ammunition expenditure during major raids reached astronomical figures. On a typical mission involving 600 bombers, not unusual by mid-1944, the formations carried approximately 4.5 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition aloft, if even. 20% of that ammunition was fired during the mission. A conservative estimate for contested raids that represented 900,000 rounds expended in a few hours. The Germans couldn't produce that much fighter ammunition in a week for their entire air force. The physical evidence of this disparity littered the battlefields. Crashed B-17s in Germany were often found with substantial ammunition, remaining evidence that the defensive fire had been sufficient to deter attacks or drive off fighters before ammunition exhaustion. Crashed German fighters, by contrast, were almost always found with empty ammunition bays. The pilots had fired everything they had, exhausted their offensive capability, and still failed to destroy enough bombers to make the attacks worthwhile. By autumn 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved air supremacy over Germany. The Luftwaffe still existed, still flew missions, still occasionally inflicted significant losses, but it could no longer contest American daylight operations with any reasonable expectation of success. Bomber formations flew to targets throughout Germany, dropped their loads, and returned home with loss rates that had declined to 1 or 2% sustainable indefinitely given American production capacity. The 50 caliber guns were no longer the primary defense. Escort fighters bore that burden. But the guns remained essential for those moments when fighters penetrated the escort screen, when mechanical failures forced bombers to drop behind their formations, when wounded aircraft limped home alone through hostile airspace. The guns were the last resort, the final protection, and they were very good at their job. The statistics from late war missions told the story. In December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew over 24,000 sorties and lost 197 heavy bombers, a loss rate under 1%. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost roughly 300 fighters in aerial combat over the Reich during the same period. The attrition ratio had completely reversed from the dark days of 1943. The Germans were now losing aircraft and pilots at rates they could not possibly sustain. The ammunition production figures for 1944 illustrated American industrial dominance. U.S. plants produced over 2 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition that year alone, more than the cumulative total of all German cannon ammunition produced during the entire war. The monthly production rate exceeded 150 million rounds. That single month's production represented more ammunition than most air forces fired during the entire conflict. It was industrial capacity weaponized, turned into a strategic advantage that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. German intelligence officers analyzing captured American equipment in late 1944 wrote reports that bordered on despair. The manufacturing quality remained exceptional. The supply systems functioned flawlessly. The ammunition was perfect every round to specification, no variations, no defects. They compared this to their own situation. Factories bombed weekly, rail networks disrupted, raw materials in chronic shortage, workers exhausted or conscripted, quality control sacrificed for quantity. The contrast was absolute. One particularly detailed German intelligence report from November 1944 examined a crashed B-17 and catalogued its ammunition load with precision. The aircraft carried 7,400 rounds distributed across its 13 gun positions, slightly below full capacity, suggesting some positions had fired during combat. The ammunition dated from September 1944, meaning it was less than 2 months old when loaded. German analysts noted that their own fighter units were sometimes forced to use ammunition manufactured in 1941 or 42 because newer production couldn't meet demand. 4-year-old ammunition suffered degradation powder, deterioration, primer reliability issues, case corrosion that reduced effectiveness. The Americans were using ammunition manufactured weeks or months before loading. The report's conclusion was blunt. The enemy's industrial capacity makes prolonged resistance impossible. Every aspect of their military supply demonstrates abundance that we cannot match. The ammunition alone represents production capacity, exceeding our total small arms and cannon ammunition combined. This disparity will only increase as their production expands and ours contracts under bombardment. By early 1945, the air war over Germany had become a massacre. The Luftwaffe threw what remained of its fighter force into desperate defensive battles, accepting catastrophic losses in attempts to disrupt individual raids. They achieved tactical successes, single missions that saw dozens of bombers destroyed, but these victories were Pyrrhic. The Americans replaced losses within days. The Germans couldn't replace theirs at all. The 50 caliber guns continued doing their job. Gunners tracked targets, fired controlled bursts, watched fighters break away, trailing smoke or flames. The weapons functioned with the same reliability in the war's final months as they had in 1942. The ammunition feeding systems never failed, the barrels never burst, the mechanisms never ceased. It was testament to engineering excellence and manufacturing precision that would become legendary in military circles. The last strategic bombing missions of the European war flew in April 1945 as Allied ground forces closed on Berlin from east and west. The bombers still carried their 13 guns, still loaded 7,500 rounds, and still maintained formation discipline. But the German fighter opposition had essentially collapsed. Most missions encountered no airborne resistance at all. The Luftwaffe's remaining fighters were grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on their airfields by marauding Allied fighters. The crews that had fought through the bloody fall of 1943, that had pressed attacks through walls of defensive fire during 1944, were dead or captured or had retreated to training roles far from the front lines. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The strategic bombing campaign ended with it. Final accounting showed the 8th Air Force had lost nearly 5,000 heavy bombers in combat, the majority B-17s. Over 35,000 aircrew were killed in action. The casualty rate among bomber crews exceeded 70% when accounting for killed, wounded, and captured. It was among the highest casualty rates of any American combat unit in any theater. But the campaign achieved its objectives. German industrial capacity was systematically destroyed. Transportation networks were shattered, fuel production collapsed. The Wehrmacht in the field faced chronic shortages of everything from ammunition to spare parts because the factories and logistics that supported them had been reduced to rubble. The strategic bombing offensive, combined with Soviet offensives in the east and Allied advances in the west, made German defeat inevitable. The 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun that had armed those bombers continued in service long after the war ended. It remains in American military inventory today, 80 years after its combat debut, largely unchanged from the World War II configuration. It is the longest-serving small arm in American military history. The reasons for this longevity trace directly to its World War II performance, absolute reliability, devastating effectiveness, and mechanical simplicity that allows operation under extreme conditions. The ammunition likewise remained standard for decades. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge armed everything, from fighter aircraft to armored vehicles to heavy machine gun positions. Modern versions use improved propellants and projectiles, but the basic design that same cartridge German engineers examined in 1943 remains current. No replacement has proven sufficiently superior to justify the enormous cost of transitioning to a new standard. The legacy of the B-17's defensive armament extends beyond the specific weapons and ammunition. It represents a philosophy of warfare that prioritized industrial capacity and technological superiority over tactical elegance. The Americans accepted that their bombers would face determined opposition and designed systems to overwhelm that opposition through sheer volume. 13 guns was excessive by any reasonable standard. Most bombers from other nations carried half that number or less. But the Americans could afford 13 guns per aircraft, could afford 7,500 rounds per mission, could afford to replace lost aircraft within weeks. That excess was the point. It demonstrated to friend and enemy alike that American industrial capacity was functionally unlimited. German officers examining the wreckage of B-17s during the war understood this implicitly. The ammunition containers weren't simply metal boxes holding cartridges. They were symbols of an industrial machine that operated beyond German comprehension factories, producing billions of rounds annually, supply chains delivering those rounds to forward bases with clockwork precision, logistics networks ensuring that ammunition was never in short supply regardless of expenditure rates. Every round represented resources: brass, steel, powder, primers that Germany increasingly lacked. Every gun represented manufacturing capacity that Germany couldn't match even in peacetime, much less while being systematically bombed. The tactical lessons learned during the B-17 campaign influenced aerial warfare doctrine for generations. The importance of fighter escort, the limitations of defensive armament alone, the need for air supremacy before strategic bombing could succeed, these became foundational principles. Modern air forces don't attempt unescorted deep penetration bombing precisely because the World War II experience demonstrated its unsustainability against determined opposition. The bombers of 1943 proved that even exceptional defensive firepower couldn't compensate for lack of fighter cover. But within the constraints of their operational environment, the 50 caliber guns performed magnificently. They forced German fighters to adopt increasingly dangerous tactics. They inflicted steady attrition on the Luftwaffe fighter force. They gave bomber crews a fighting chance when separated from their formations. They allowed damaged aircraft to defend themselves during lonely flights home through hostile territory. The guns didn't win the air war fighter. Escorts and overwhelming numerical superiority won the air war, but they kept American losses manageable during the critical period before escorts arrived, and they remained effective throughout the conflict. The human cost of manning those guns deserves remembrance. Gunners stood at their positions for hours in sub-zero temperatures at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe unaided. They watched friends die in adjacent aircraft. They faced fighters attacking at 600 miles per hour closure rates with seconds to react. They operated machinery that could jam, malfunction, or overheat at critical moments. They did this mission after mission, knowing that statistically, their chances of completing a 25-mission tour approached 50-50 at best during the dark months of 1943 and early 1944. Some gunners achieved ace status 5 or more confirmed aerial victories, though their achievements were rarely celebrated outside their own units. Staff Sergeant Michael Baruth of the 91st Bomb Group was credited with 17 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest-scoring non-pilot aces of the war. Technical Sergeant Arthur Benko destroyed 12 German fighters. These men developed gunnery skills that bordered on supernatural, the ability to lead targets instinctively, to track erratically maneuvering fighters, to fire the precise burst at the precise moment that meant the difference between a miss and a kill. Most gunners never achieved ace status. Most never knew with certainty whether their fire destroyed, damaged, or simply scared off attacking fighters. Combat occurred too fast for confirmation. Multiple gunners engaged single targets. Fighters broke away trailing smoke that might indicate fatal damage or might be temporary engine problems. The chaos of aerial combat made accurate assessment nearly impossible. But the cumulative effect of thousands of gunners firing millions of rounds created an environment where attacking bomber formations was extraordinarily dangerous for German pilots, and that deterrent effect was perhaps more valuable than confirmed kills. The story of the 50 caliber ammunition and the 13-gun armament of the B-17 is ultimately a story about industrial warfare and the mathematics of attrition. The Germans who examined captured ammunition in 1943 understood immediately what they faced, not a superior weapon system in isolation, but a superior industrial system that could produce and sustain weapon systems at scales that made tactical innovation increasingly irrelevant. No amount of pilot skill could overcome ammunition shortages. No tactical brilliance could compensate for being outnumbered 3-1, or 5-1, or 10-1. No courage could substitute for fuel or spare parts or replacement aircraft. The 13 guns represented American abundance applied to warfare. They were excessive, redundant, over-engineered, and perfectly suited to their purpose. They kept German fighters at bay through volume of fire rather than precision. They demonstrated that in modern industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, and they remain emblematic of the fundamental truth that decided the Second World War. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical excellence when fighting a prolonged conflict of attrition. The Germans learned this lesson at terrible cost. Their pilots were among the finest in the world, their aircraft often technically superior, their tactics innovative and aggressive, but they were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose 10 aircraft for every one German loss and still emerge victorious, because those 10 aircraft would be replaced before the next mission, while the German loss would never be replaced at all. The 50 caliber rounds that German engineers measured and analyzed weren't merely ammunition. They were harbingers of defeat, physical evidence that Germany had entered a war it could not win because it could not match the industrial output of its enemies. In the end, the question wasn't whether German pilots were brave enough or skilled enough or determined enough to stop the American daylight bombing offensive. They were all those things and more. The question was whether courage and skill could overcome material disadvantage measured in orders of magnitude. The answer, written in the wreckage of thousands of aircraft scattered across Europe, was no. Industrial capacity decided the war. The 50 caliber guns were simply one manifestation of that capacity, reliable, devastating, and produced in such quantities that waste became acceptable and excess became doctrine. The B-17 crews who manned those guns never fully appreciated the broader implications. They focused on immediate concerns, staying alive, completing missions, getting home to bases in England. But their collective effort, sustained over 3 years of brutal aerial combat, helped destroy the Luftwaffe, an effective fighting force, and cleared the skies over Europe for the invasion that would liberate the continent. The guns they fired, the ammunition they expended, the formations they maintained, all were components of a military machine that ultimately proved unstoppable, not because of brilliance, but because of scale. That scale was what German officers understood when they examined captured 50 caliber ammunition in 1943. They weren't looking at particularly advanced technology. The Browning M2 was fundamentally a World War I design, refined through decades of incremental improvement. They were looking at technology deployed at scales their own industrial base could never hope to match. Every round represented a small piece of an industrial capacity so vast that individual losses barely registered. That capacity, more than any tactical innovation, more than any technological advantage, more than courage or skill, decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. The 50 caliber guns did their job. The crews who manned them did their job. The supply chains that fed them did their job. Together, they demonstrated that in modern warfare, logistical excellence and industrial capacity matter more than martial virtue. It's an uncomfortable truth, one that diminishes the importance of individual courage and skill. But it's the truth that emerged from the skies over Europe between 1942 and 1945, written in smoke trails and falling aircraft and the steady hammer of 13 machine guns per bomber, mission after mission, until the enemy could no longer resist. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.